The issues of large-scale structural racism, they just pervade all parts of society. They pervade the food and hospitality and media world, and these problems are never going to be solved within a generation. But the work I do, I do it for the next generation. You know, I do it to make things easier for them, to make the burden lighter, to make the barriers smaller.
For many people in Australia, the pandemic started about a year ago, last March. But for Chinese Australians and other Asian communities in Australia, the impacts of the pandemic were felt much earlier, as soon as word started coming out about a virus that originated in China's Hubei province. People avoided Asian restaurants, Chinatowns emptied out, and anti-Asian racism surged. It was ugly and upsetting and, of course, deeply unfair. But discrimination against Asians in Australia isn't at all new, and it comes in forms that are both explicit, systemic, careless and ignorant. All of them can be hurtful and damaging. As part of a series of discussions about anti-Asian racism, we're speaking today to Yvonne C. to unpick and unpack some of these issues. Yvonne is digital editor of Gourmet Traveller magazine and a founding member of Diversity in Food Media, which we'll hear more about during this episode. I admire her journalism greatly, and I'm delighted to have her on the show. Welcome, Yvonne.
Oh, wow. Thanks, Dani. What an intro. And so lovely to hear it read from such a respected journalist like you. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you. Please start by telling us a bit about yourself, your career, and, of course, your interest in food.
I don't have the most conventional road to food writing, but I don't think anyone really does. I started actually doing a classical music degree, as many food writers do. But while I was doing that, and after I graduated from that, I always had nurtured and harnessed this interest in food, whether it be cooking it myself or eating it out, and also reading it a lot. So consumption in many senses of the word. And I just tried writing. I contacted an online publication who had done this call out for new writers. I think I wrote about the 10 best brunches in Sydney, or one of those listicles. And I realized I had a knack for it. Got really good feedback from the editor of this publication. And from there, the work just kind of grew and grew. My name just started getting out to different editors, or I would contact them there directly. I'd be given more and more assignments to write about new restaurants around Sydney. There was one really formative moment where I noticed on Broadsheet, Sydney, the editor at the time was a woman called Sarah Norris. And I was like, Sarah Norris, why does that name ring a bell? And I realized it was back in high school. I did work experience at a little street music publication called Drum Media. And Sarah was the editor at the time. And I just emailed her out of the blue and said, hey, I don't know if you remember me, but I did work experience back with you about 10 years ago. And it would be cool to write for Broadsheet if you'll have me. And she was like, oh, yeah, I remember you. Because that week she had been moving house and had come across a box of things. And in one of them was a picture of me and her together back in, the early or late to mid 2000s.
Wow.
Me with a really, really, really ugly haircut. Sarah just kind of dressed in peak mid 2000s garb. We were standing underneath a poster of Eskimo Joe, which is also peak mid 2000s music. And I remember this photo so vividly because at Drum Media, I took my work experience very, very seriously. And on the last day of my work experience there, I behaved like I'd been at the newspaper, I'd been at the publication for years, and I went around taking photos of everyone who I'd worked with that week.
Love it.
And I printed that photo and gave it to Sarah. She remembered me 10, 15 years down the track and invited me to write more for broadsheets. So I think the lesson here for any aspiring food writers is take photos of the people you work with and print it and send it to them because they might remember you later.
Yeah.
And then from the work just grew, and I got invited to, I applied for the job at Gourmet Traveller as its digital editor, and here I am.
I think that's great. And I think, a great lesson in that for aspiring writers, but I guess aspiring anybody, is just to do it and to reach out to people. And it's really great. I love that. What's your instrument?
So I'm a percussionist and a drummer.
Wow.
So yeah, I play drums currently in a band called Dragon Fruit, which the other half of Dragon Fruit is another excellent musician and also a food writer called Colin Ho. And when I was at uni studying percussion, I played all the instruments of the percussion section of the orchestra, as a lot of classical musicians do. So I played the big timpani, you would play snare drum. You would have lessons on how to play a tambourine and a triangle properly, because there is actually a very refined technique to doing it. So, and none of that comes in handy for being a food writer, I can tell you that.
I'm sure there's something that comes in handy. I don't know what it could be. Now, my brother and sister are both percussionists, so I feel very aligned with your journey.
Oh, really? Wow.
Yeah. So I grew up in a very musical household, and I just hacked away at, various instruments. But my brother and sister, certainly took it further. And they're both professional musicians and and play drums and percussion. So I think, yes, I think the percussionists have to be so incredibly versatile and be able to, I think also the way that that independent rhythm that drummers aspire to, where your hands and your feet can be doing completely different things. I feel like that is incredibly good for the brain. So I'm sure you've got a lot of that kind of stuff.
And I guess maybe, when you're situated at the back of an orchestra, you have this real knack for observing the behaviors of other people and how they interact with each other. And I guess maybe that comes into that helps when you're interviewing a person and kind of observing a situation around you. You notice the little ticks and quirks in people, which is why if there's going to be any handiness to being percussionist in my current industry, maybe that's it.
Yeah, I think that's great. So we're chatting this week about anti-Asian racism. And I mean, there are so many things about even saying that where I sort of have to half catch myself. I mean, one thing is I'm very conscious that Asia is not a monolith. I think there are 48 countries in Asia, hundreds of languages, that it's a nonsense to say Chinese food. This whole discussion seems quite flattening. And yet I do think it's important to have it. But at the same time as thinking it's important to air these issues and confront them, I'm also really conscious of not wanting to put the weight of the conversation and all the explaining on people who are of Asian background. And as I say that and then ask you what your thoughts are on this and whether you're sick of, quote unquote, doing the work, I feel like I'm doing exactly what I've said I want to be really cautious about. And yet here we are.
I think there's a fine line, right? And I think about this a lot. I think a lot about representation and about burden and about labor when it comes to issues of racism. I remember reading about Reni Eddo-Lodge, who's an incredible Black British writer. And in 2017, she wrote a book called Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race. It's a brilliant book where she writes about the deep, deep racism and history of Britain. So that was back in 2017. And since then, with Black Lives Matter of 2020, and I guess this louder discussion that's been had in the public discourse about racism and what that means, she's actually given very few interviews to media outlets since. And she says because everything she said in the book still applies. And I think about this a lot. I also think about when we're having these conversations about race and racism, in what ways can we talk about it without perpetuating it? Because when I read media and when I write stories where food and race intersect, as a person of Chinese and Vietnamese descent, I think it's really important to not indulge in this weird, like, oppression porn, where people of colour and writers of colour feel this burden to talk about, you know, their worst racist experience they've ever had just for the white gaze or just for the performance for the benefit of a white audience. So when I get asked whether I'm sick of doing the work, sometimes, I think about doing it in the most efficient way. And that means I've given up on expending my energy on really small, futile, everyday arguments. So, you know, that means I'm not arguing with distant relatives over the Christmas table anymore about racism. The reasons for those are twofold. That one, there's a huge indignity about having to prove over and over again that you're human, that as an Asian Australian you're human, that First Nations people are human, that queer people are humans. It's incredibly humiliating. No one should have to beg a white person for them to be seen as a living being. And the other reason I don't indulge in those everyday futile conversations is because ultimately it's really tiring. I've got other shit to do in my life, you know. I have books to read, I have washing to do, I have runs to jog out. I don't think about race all the time. I think about it a lot, but it's not the sum of my being. But then I think also about, and I'm especially mindful that in food media, there are so few writers of colour in Australia, right? And though I'm not the gatekeeper for the Asian Australian community, or for food writers of colour. But I guess in the past 12 months, I have written works that have made an impact, which is, you know, for a person like myself who's just is so who doesn't embrace the spotlight. It's been really strange to realize that people associate my work with something that's important and worthy of discussion. It's extremely humbling. It's also very strange. So I'm aware that my words now have an impact and they have an audience. So in that sense, I'm happy to do the work. I'm happy to discuss my thoughts at times of my choosing. If it means that another writer of colour reads my words or hears my interviews and thinks, hey, I'm not crazy, like, I feel this too. These words that she's writing or that she's speaking really resonate with my experiences. And I want to be part of this movement, because the issues of large-scale structural racism, they just pervade all parts of society. They pervade the food and hospitality and media world. And these problems are never going to be solved within a generation. But the work I do, I do it for the next generation. You know, I do it to make things easier for them, to make the burden lighter, to make the barriers smaller. So when people ask me, am I sick of doing the work? I say I do it because I want to make it better for the next generation.
Yeah, well, that's really, I don't know, it's gracious and generous and powerful and, yeah, obviously incredibly well thought through. So I'm really grateful that you are having this conversation with me. And I have no doubt that the work that you do and the fact that it's you that is doing it will have and are having a really big impact.
Thanks. Yeah. And I think it's also, when I talked about efficiency earlier before, I'm also mindful that with Gourmet Traveller, I have a national platform. With this podcast, I have a national platform. And it's just a matter of using as few words as possible to make an impact and reaching the most people. And even if it doesn't change people's minds, you just really hope that sometime down the track, like those words kind of like echo in their heads a little bit, and they're like, oh, that thing I heard on Dani's podcast, that thing I read in Gourmet Traveller, like that I hadn't really entertained those thoughts before, that maybe it will kind of spark that thinking. And I said, there was a really interesting conversation I had a couple of months ago with a story I wrote about restaurant names. And it was kind of a work in progress story at that point that I was writing for Gourmet Traveller, a really big feature about restaurant names that were potentially racist and problematic. And I met this woman at a party. She asked me what I did and what I was working on. I was like, well, I'm a food writer. I'm working on this story about racist restaurant names, which is not exactly light party conversation starter. She was a white woman in her 40s, and I used an example of a restaurant that had a racist name, and she was like, "Oh, I actually think that's a really funny name." And I was like, okay, well, I'm not, like, it's a bit tiring to have to explain why it's racist, and also, like, we're in this party, there's some cool kind of music playing, and I'm hard of hearing as it is. I'm not going to have to, like, shout about racism to you. But then in the same conversation, my friend entered, and she's a incredible writer and in the fiction world. And at that time, she was working on a play about Western Sydney. She mentioned it to this white woman about this play she was working on. And she said, oh, it's about Western Sydney. It's about how people of colour live their lives in Western Sydney and their stories and experiences. And even though my friend hadn't mentioned race, this woman, through her filter that was new to her, was like, in the past 15 minutes, the both of you have talked about race, and I've never thought about race before. And I felt extremely uncomfortable that she had pointed that out, but I also felt quite a little bit gratified because it was the first time that this woman had the issue, like the conversation about race, cross her everyday life. And even though at that point I hadn't turned her, it wasn't my responsibility it wasn't the time to do it. I just hope she walked away from that and was like, oh, racism, huh? That's the real thing. It's going to take a few more steps for her to get there. But it's just about that spark, for a lot of people. But also for a lot of Asian Australians, for a lot of people of colour, they're beyond the spark and they just want to hear more of it in the media. They want to read more about it in the media. They want to see more representation of themselves in the media.
Yeah, I think everyone starts in a different place, and I guess, everybody grows up in different scenarios and is exposed to different things. And of course, some people try to expose themselves to more than other people. But I think it is so interesting. It's hard to imagine that woman walking out of that party and not encountering more conversations and prompts to consider racism. I think it's, when you learn a new word, you hear that word everywhere. And I feel like once you're tuned in, or you allow yourself to tune in to problems around representation and racism and the way that language is used and the way that race and power intersect. The privilege of not having to think about racism is enormous. So it's I guess, it's that idea of people can't be what they don't see. And I guess it's like, I guess you are doing a lot of work simply by being in the role that you are, as you say. And yeah, hopefully it's just that role does a lot of the work for you, the platform and the role, and it doesn't have to be constantly exhausting for you as a person as well. Yeah, well, I mean, I love that article about Asian restaurant names, and I'm not surprised to hear that, you know, it was something that you worked on for a really long time. And, you know, I have to say, you know, I'm from a previous generation of writers to you, and I really welcome your voice. And I think, you know, there, as you say, there are too few diverse voices in Australian food media, and I think Australian food media is definitely due for a reckoning. And you know, I put myself in that. I think some of some of my words in the past have been careless, and I think but I guess hopefully I'm open to learning and doing better. And I really welcome the opportunity to do better and to learn more and to keep learning.
But, and I think with the issues of racism and writing in food media is that no one's ever perfect. Like, I've definitely made missteps in the past, and I think it's just really important for readers and fellow writers to also be forgiving when these transgressions occur. You know, cancel culture is never really a fun thing. And I think people's worldviews and the style in which they write about certain stories change as the conversations change. You know, things that I would have written about maybe 5 years ago, 10 years ago, you know, I've most likely called an Asian restaurant cheap and cheerful in the past, which now I realize is kind of really quite a pejorative term to use. But unfortunately, like you said before, like you only know what you see. And I think it's incumbent upon food writers in Australia, like when there is a change coming. So what are you going to do now to make sure you don't create further harm with your words? And what are you going to do from your position of privilege to lift other writers, other chefs, other restaurants that don't come from such a privileged background? And I'm wary of myself that a lot of discussions about race don't really touch on issues of class as well, because I'm from the middle class myself. I'm very lucky to have two lovely, amazing parents who provided for me all the way from when I was a kid to my education. I was lucky enough to go to university. But as a result, that language that I've absorbed through tertiary education and through the literature I read now, that kind of puts me in a camp where sometimes the work I read, the work I write is not super accessible to people who didn't have the benefit of a sound education. I think about that, but then at the same time, when I was writing this story about racist restaurants, and I was about why authentic, like concepts of authenticity and cheap Asian restaurant damaging, I was talking with my parents who were refugees of Vietnam who had an interrupted education, didn't go to university, and I was a bit hesitant about discussing it with them because I was like, oh, how much would they? They're quite liberal-minded for their generation, but I was a bit hesitant about whether and you know, English is they're very fluent in in English. It's also their fifth language, you know. So I was hesitant about how much So I was hesitant about how much my expression would have an impact on them. And I was like, hey, Mum and Dad, I'm writing about, you know, racist restaurant names, and I'm also writing about how cheap and cheerful was kind of a messed up concept. And they're like, yeah, totally. Yeah, that's really messed up. So I think there's also there's that, no, my parents didn't get a tertiary education, but these issues of race, they totally get it. They totally get it in food. And I think we just need to be mindful of the deep intersectional issues about race, class, gender, all of it, right? We're just all on this like learning trajectory about making it better for the next generation.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, yeah, to pick out race is in a sense quite flattening as well. It's as, it is, we're all more than one thing. And I think sometimes the language, I think, can clarify feelings that people haven't had words for in the past. And, I think about something like microaggressions. And to me, I didn't, I've heard that word, I didn't know what it meant. But as soon as you sort of have it explained to you and have some context put around it, I think it really lets a lot of pennies drop, and it's can, explain, this is why I feel so tired. This is why I don't want to go out. This is why this just makes me feel bad in some way that I haven't been able to quite explain before. So I think putting these sort of frameworks around it, which can seem, I guess, academic or privileged to have these ways of describing things. It can, if someone's already feeling it, like your parents, it doesn't, they're going to understand it.
Yeah, I think intuition is such a strong thing as well. Like if something's not sitting right, it probably isn't. And then you back that up. Like I remember returning also back to Reni Eddo-Lodge. She's an essayist and the essayist and the journalist. She has these deep-seated feelings about racism and its existence in the UK. But being a journalist, she backs that up with evidence. Like all her work has like some solid research and reading and interviews in there. And I feel I'm not comparing myself to her, but I think, that's just what you do as a writer. You twinge on something, you feel it in the community that you operate, and then you test your hypothesis. You're like, is this what other people are feeling? Who are the experts in this field? Who are the grassroots people who could also be feeling this, and what are their feelings? And that's definitely the approach I've taken with a few stories. Well, all the stories I've written, but particularly the big capital R race pieces I've written for Gourmet Traveller recently. Like that need and that solidness in your research has to be there.
Yeah. You've got to be able to back it up, and you've got to be able to, I guess, point to the facts that support your support your argument.
Yeah. Back yourself up. Put all your Year 5 debating skills to excellent use. Dredge that out again.
Do you want to just talk a little bit in detail about the racist restaurant name story, just for people who haven't read it, and we will put a link to it, but just talk just tell us a little bit about it.
So it was a story that I wrote and was published in February in Gourmet Traveller. It's a story that had been sitting in my mind for a really long time. As as a food writer, you'll know, Dani, you get press releases that flood your inbox every day. And there were a couple that passed my way where I was like, this is really, really weird. There's a restaurant called Some Young Guys, spelled SUMYUNGGUYS. And it's kind of hard to explain on a podcast, but essentially the stylizing of the spelling and of the logo and of the restaurant, which is a Southeast Asian fusion restaurant in Queensland, is done in a way where it conveys general Asianness. And I thought it was really strange. And at the same time, another press release passed my inbox that was called Madame Nhu, which is a Vietnamese restaurant owned and operated by a Vietnamese owner. And I know that from what I knew of my scarce knowledge of history in the 60s is that Madame Nhu was a really contentious figure in Vietnamese history. And I was like, oh, why did both these restaurants name their restaurants such? And kind of started exploring, like, a restaurant name says a lot about what a restaurant wants to be, who it's trying to appeal to, and what it's standing for. So I kind of explored, like, some young guys, what's the go? Why choose such problematic styling of your restaurant? Who's behind the restaurant? And it's for white owners in Queensland, and try to maybe in a sense give them the benefit of the doubt about their restaurant. I mean, my hypothesis that I was testing is that Some Young Guys is a racist restaurant name. But the thing is, I didn't really have to dig too hard to interrogate the intent of the owners. Everything they said about the restaurant name, that it's taken from a line in, what's the movie? It's Wayne's World.
Wayne's World, yeah.
You know, the height of fine comedy in the 80s, which was a, you know, extreme era of tact for comedic cinema and highly representative of cultures and genders. It was taken from that. There was a video of two of the owners talking about the origins of their name and them talking about how they knew it was problematic, but they still went ahead with it. And to their credit, they did respond. They don't respond explicitly to my questions about whether they have received a lot of complaints about their name, whether they've done anything about it. But they did give me a statement, and I think this statement, for me writing the story, it kind of really embodied what is wrong with the white restaurant world, and when white owners are blind to the insensitivities of their name, and how it can really misrepresent or really homogenize and really perpetuate these quite, like, for want of a better word, really white bread representations of a hugely diverse culture. On the other side, I also spoke with the owner of one of the owners of Madame Nhu. It's a Vietnamese Australian man, Minh Nguyen. And he provided an extremely nuanced explanation about why he would choose to name a Vietnamese restaurant Madame Nhu. So Madame Nhu is the de facto first lady of South Vietnam in the, I want to say the 50s and 60s. I might have to fact check that. Forgive me. It's been a while since I've written this story. She has some pretty infamous quotes where she talked about the self-immolation Buddhist monks at that time. She described them as a barbecue. And that's kind of one of the most notorious quotes that lives on, that can be attributed to her. She was, you know, some pretty charged things about the United States, and said some pretty charged things about communists as well. She kind of took aim at anybody, but she was a source of fascination for Western scholars and journalists for a really long time. And basically what Minh Nguyen said, the reason he named the restaurant after her was kind of to reclaim this part of her back. Because in the foreign press, or in the Western press, she's been portrayed as this, like, dragon lady. That's what they called her at the time, this dragon lady. But for him, she represented this time of, like, big social movement in South Vietnam, and where there was mass migration of North Vietnamese people to South Vietnamese people, and how it really changed and disseminated certain food cultures across the country, and how that time, because of the migration of people from North to South, it helped proliferate the popularization of pho. And I just really liked how he knew that maybe this name was controversial, but he had the words, he had the vocabulary to articulate how he felt and why, and to kind of defend himself, really.
It's really incredible. And I just gone back to your article. So she was the de facto first lady from 1955 to 1963. So you were on it. I think that's so amazing. Like as you said in the beginning, a restaurant's name is very powerful and it really does say who they are. Of course, it is just a name, so it can't say everything. But I think the difference between those responses, where one is really offhanded, dismissive, and not using that opportunity for self-reflection, and thus disappointing and deepening the hurt, it's so different to this really thoughtful, nuanced, embedded in history and knowledge response about this other restaurant, or these restaurants in Sydney. It's so interesting. And I think, the responses, the article is excellent. And the response that's within the article from the Madam News owner, and the response that's appended to it from the Some Young Guys owners, they're so diametric, aren't they?
Yeah, they are. And I mean, look, I'm actually surprised this story hasn't been written before. And when I was writing the story, I did a lot of, I looked high and low over the internet in Australian food media, because I was like, surely someone's touched not just upon this restaurant before, or kind of explored the meaning behind their name, but a whole lot of other restaurants in Australia. And it really surprised me that it hasn't been written about before, because I know I'm not the only one to think about it. And I think it kind of says a lot about the state of Australian food media, where there is like it's a chicken egg thing. There's like a lack of culture for exploring race and representation. There's a risk averseness in the food media landscape, and that's fueled by so many things, like lack of resource, the digital age, like chasing of clickbait. But I really feel this story was long overdue. And the response to the story, for the most part, shows that it really hit a nerve with a lot of people who eat out at restaurants, who consume food media, or are just from, who are just readers of colour like me. I just hope that it's not the last of stories of this oeuvre, that other writers, and hopefully more writers of colour enter the fold, that there is this confidence of telling our stories and expressing the thoughts of so many diners and readers of colour in the community.
I agree with all of that, but I would also say it shouldn't just be writers of colour that pick up on these things. It should be anyone.
Yeah, but I think there's something to be said about being a person of colour that gives you a perspective about these issues. Yeah, there's a perspective of being a person of colour, of your lived experiences, and like you mentioned before, just the accumulation of these experiences you've had that informs you and kind of gets under your skin, but then it kind of gets onto the page as well. There's a really great book I've read recently called Minor Feelings by Kathy Park Hong, and she talks about this exact thing, about just this pattern of things that build up over your lifetime, when you're told one thing but your feelings are another. These minor feelings accumulate over time. And when I have seen particular restaurant names in the past that have irked me, your first thought as a person of colour is to go, nah, that can't be it. And then the more you dig, the more you surprise yourself at the quite public displays of misrepresentations of of people of color. Yeah, you see it a lot, and then it's only when it kind of gets to a breaking point, like maybe I did, when seeing like a whole bunch of problems, like one day I was just seeing a whole bunch of weird press releases pass my inbox, and I was like, okay, it's time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Can we talk about the diversity in food media? You're a founding member of that group. Can you talk about your role?
I'm one of the I think about 6 or 7 co-founders of Diversity in Food Media Australia, and I'm sure if I try to name everyone, I will inevitably miss someone. But we have a website up, diversityinmedia.com.au. You might have to.
Yeah, we'll find it. Yep.
That lists who we are and which publications we come from, or whether we're a freelancer. But it came about, I would like to say, when the whole Bon Appetit thing was happening in 2020. And I think these are all writers that I've respected over the time that I've worked in food media, writers who actively seek out stories from migrant communities, from First Nations communities, and who, like me, have seen a food media landscape in Australia that was not representative of the stories we were telling and the food that we were eating. And it was time to, band together and try to do something about it. In baby steps, mind you, because we are all hustling for work for the freelancers, and also just hustling to do our jobs that we get paid for. It's a volunteer organisation, and the work we do is really to, in small steps, increase the voices of people of colour, people with disability, First Nations people, people of queer identifying people in the food media world, because these are voices that, across society don't really get heard as much, and we're missing out on a lot of delicious stories. Really, diversity in food media is about increasing the voice of increasing the diversity of writers and also the talent, right? So part of the work that my colleague Lee Tran Lam has been doing through the Diversity in Food Media account has been profiling different chefs, different writers, stylists and photographers who work in food media, and highlighting the incredible work they do. And full credit, like that's all her work. I can't even take credit for it. She does it in her own time and does such a stellar job of it. Another thing that Lee Tran has done with diversity in food media is released a book of emerging writers, published in conjunction with Some Kind Press, and just about writers who haven't had extensive publication experience before, but kind of giving them the opportunity to see their work in published form. The other thing we're working on is a spreadsheet of writers of colour it's like an open spreadsheet, so editors can check it out, and if they want to commission new and emerging writers, they can. We're also going to be doing the same with chefs as well, and talent who want to be interviewed. If you're like an expert in Burmese food, but food media never approaches you because you don't have the money or resource to hire PR, you put your name on the spreadsheet, and then hopefully an editor sees your stuff and wants to interview you and tell your amazing story. In a nutshell, we're basically just trying to make things better for writers who are not white, who are not cisgender, who are not straight, who are not able-bodied, and just kind of help them get a leg in with the industry.
I absolutely love it. I've got New Voices on Food, the Lee Tran Lam anthology, on my desk in front of me always. I think it's so great and really, really eye-opening, and it just also feels like it's just the start of something that is going to be big and beautiful and continue to create change. And I did not know about the spreadsheet, and I'm so excited. I'm just going to be all over that. That's fantastic. Yvonne, would you like to highlight any other writers who are doing great work in this space?
So many. Well, you know, the work you've been doing, Dani, about highlighting Americans in Australia who've been left behind as a result of the pandemic has been largely appreciated and widely read, and just, you know, incredible work on your part. Not easy work either. I can see it. So thank you for writing all these stories. There's also the work of, well, to my friends, Colin Ho, who I play in a band with, probably a conflict of interest there, but as a standalone food writer, he's incredible. His co-writer a lot of the time is Nick Jordan, and both of them have written, well, they kind of, I think in my recent memory, kind of lifted the lid about bias against, for want of a better word, ethnic restaurants in a lot of restaurant guides in Australian food media. They wrote about that, I think, back in 2018 for ABC, and I think the story is called One Price for Pasta, Another for Noodles, and it is an incredible and one of the most life-changing stories I remember reading back in 2018. They've since written an incredible story for Counter magazine about restaurant reviews, which kind of continues on for that really great work.
Yeah, they interviewed me for that, and it's a great magazine, and it's an excellent article.
Man, Counter magazine, it's just, yeah, it's I don't know how they managed to make it look so schmick and commission such excellent stories, and yeah, just push out really great work, seemingly without the backer of a large publishing organization. Just like hats off to them. There's also smaller blogs or independent online publications. There's Roshani Ipa, who runs Culinary Mag, who's incredible. Jess Ho has a newsletter that everyone should subscribe to. Soleil Ho who's not a small-time blogger. She's a big-time restaurant critic who writes for the San Francisco Chronicle, has really done some incredible stories about everything, about race, diversity, the whole bag. And I can't even try to articulate her writing, but it really makes an impact on me every time I read her work. Oh gosh, there's just a lot, isn't there?
There are a lot of people doing great stuff.
Yeah. I also want to give a shout out to SBS Food, who have for a long time been doing the work without anyone asking them to. I think Farah Sigello is the managing editor there, and they just tell they're so community focused with their writing, and they are kind of the quiet achievers of the food media world, I think. And everyone should go onto their website and read all the stories that they commission, and they just do so with such grace and such sound storytelling, I think. Yeah, shout out to SBS Food. Yo, public broadcasters.
Yeah, I'm with you there. Yvonne, it's been amazing to talk to you. I feel like we could keep going for another hour or two. There's no shortage of things to talk about. Is there anything else that you really want to say for this, let's call it our first podcast together?
Yeah, it is our first podcast together. Yeah.
Well, it is, but I feel like it might not be the last.
I just think, look, it's important to note that for all the work that I do, for all the work that other writers of colour do, it's only so effective if people are willing to listen. And if people aren't willing to listen, I also know that the audience I write for are the people who feel me, who know my experience, who read my work with, open eyes. And that, I'm just really grateful for that. And I'm grateful for anyone who supported my work and for anyone who will support future work of other writers of colour who are doing and telling stories that haven't really entered the minds of Australian readers before. So, yeah, and thank you. And thank you, Dani, for having me.
Well, honestly, thank you for coming on the show. I think what you're doing is really important. I'm really grateful for your time and the energy and thought and commitment that you brought to this discussion. I think it's really important, and I'm really grateful. So, Yvonne C. Lamb, thank you for being part of Dirty Linen.
Thank you, Dani. Keep the linen dirty.
Yeah, rough it up. This is Dirty Linen, and I'm Dani Valent. We air the issues that the hospitality industry finds hard to talk about. We spend a week thrashing around each issue, hearing from different people with unique perspectives. We want to hear from you as well. If you have something that needs to be said about a topic, get in touch so we can include your perspective. Contact us at dirtylinen@deepintheweeds.com.au or hit us up on Insta at Dirty Linen Podcast. We can't wait to hear from you.
This